All right, we'll get into it. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Isaac Berry, PGG Rice and Seeds Product Development Manager. Hopefully, you've managed to grab a coffee and a quick bite to eat in the middle of your busy days. But thanks for jumping onto this. All you need to know about Pallaton webinar. It's the second of our 3 series for the Pallaton this week. This afternoon, we'll have myself, David Barry, Sales Manager from Tasmania, presenting along with Barry Varco, Sales Manager from South Australia, and Emma Goodall from Western Districts in Victoria. We've obviously had a lot of inquiries lately come through the retailers and the farmers, and you might be sitting on the fence on whether to plant Pallaton or not. So hopefully today this session can answer all your questions and help make your mind up. This will give you a taste of Pallaton in a quick 20-minute presentation, followed by 10 minutes of questions at the end, where we'll cover off some questions that we've had emailed through as well. If you have any questions from the presentation, you feel free to hold on to these, and you can use the raise your hand function, and we can take you off mute, or you can ask them via the comments function as well, which David will be keeping an eye on. Just letting you know, we will be recording and posting this on Facebook at a later date as well. So just make sure your questions you ask are to the point. We are, trying to get through this as quick as we can for you guys. I know you are. It is a busy schedule. In the agenda today, we'll cover off what Pallaton is and how it was bred, and being the first new Brassica species in over 30 years brought to the Australian market. David will explain the timeline of getting this product to the market, and I'll take you through the 5 important traits of Pallaton and how it separates itself from other brassicas on the market. We will briefly run through a couple of testimonials, and Barry will explain the Alec Beggs case study in a little bit more detail. And I'll take you through the importance of grazing management and the basics of getting Pallaton established. And then Emma will explain her experiences in the field and the water use efficiency as well. And next, I'll pass you on to David Squibb to introduce how Pallaton was developed and brought to the Australian market.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac, and thanks again for everyone joining in today. This is a really exciting product for us as a sales brand, to have a product that is coming to the marketplace that may not have a fit for everyone, but where we do see a fit, hopefully the results will be very profitable for you. As a business, it has taken us quite a while to develop this. We started work on this in the early 2000s with some plant populations developed in 2002. One thing we will stress from the outset, this is a non-GMO product, so certainly no genetic modification in the process. But Emma will explain in a little bit more detail around how we've gone about it. 2009, we started some field breeding and selection work. The following year, we started evaluating it from an animal performance perspective. Around about that time, we started seeing some of the early plants were a little bit sporadically bolting, some of the radish componentry showing out. So that was taken back in-house and cleaned up as a cultivar. 2015, we started more field breeding and selection work. 2018, we started our first limited seed release into a couple of key areas in the Australian marketplace. Last year, we expanded that further with full commercial release into a number of areas. And one of the pleasing things for this year is the CSIRO have jumped on board and are actually doing some trials with autumn sown Pallaton versus other options in the Australian marketplace. So they see a potential slot, and again, we'll explain why the CSIRO are certainly interested in a product like this. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of how long it has taken us to bring this product to the market. As Isaac said, it is well over 30 years since the last true forage Brassica species was released into the Australian marketplace. So based on that, I'll hand over to Emma, if that's all right, Isaac.
Yeah, thanks, David. Great timeline there, and obviously a pretty lengthy process, but rigorous and thoroughly done through the New Zealand process as well. So yeah, Emma, would you like to talk about how Pallaton was bred and what it actually is?
Yep, certainly. So carrying on from David, Pallaton is what we would call an intergeneric hybrid between radish and kale. So kale is the highest highest yielding Brassica on the market, but it is aimed at a single graze situation where you could get anywhere from 9 up into the high teens in terms of tonnages. And then radish at the other end of the spectrum is a very, very quick maturing variety that has really good drought tolerance for the Australian market. So while this is a standard breeding line, as David said, there is absolutely no genetic modification in this process. It is a fairly science heavy breeding program in terms of it goes through an embryo rescue process and then goes through chromosome doubling to end up with a viable F1 hybrid. Now, this is actually important because the process behind this breeding is one of the key things that ensures that it can't outcross to wild radish in the field. So obviously in the Australian market, particularly as we start to edge into some of the broadacre areas where they're coming back into mixed cropping enterprises, wild radish is a major concern. So through the process that is some fairly high-tech but conventional breeding, we've ended up with Pallaton Raphno Brassica.
Thanks, Emmy. You've covered some great points here and clarified a few questions that usually pop up as well. So now you've heard how Pallaton was bred and developed and brought to the market. I thought I'd better run you through the 5 important traits on how this product sets itself above forage rapes on the market. So the first important trait is the high forage yields from multiple grazings, plant persistence under multiple grazings as well. So here we're talking about 4 to 5 grazings compared to 2 or 3 of a forage rape. The increased water use efficiency, aphid tolerance over and above forage rapes on the market at the moment, and the grazing flexibility. So the first important trait in a little bit more detail is Pallaton's increased yield. So here we're talking about the increased yield over multiple grazings compared to Goliath. If we compare Pallaton to a forage rape, the first grazing is always strong for a forage rape, and we're not expecting it to Pallaton to out yield it in the first 2 cuts. It's usually the fact that Pallaton has the potential to be grazed 4 or 5 times instead of 2 or 3. So that's where we're getting our increased yield from. The second important trait of Pallaton is its strong plant persistence under multiple grazing. So, as I stated before, over a 12-month period, and this is due to its robust taproot and high drought tolerance, the increased grazings increases the overall yield compared to forage rape. Now, really important for the Australian market, the increased water use efficiency. So, this comes from its, taproot and radish breeding. Pallaton has a 38% increase in water use efficiency relative to Goliath forage rape. So basically, this just means more kilograms of dry matter produced per millimetre of water applied or from rainfall. And just looking at this photo here, we just want to point out the differences in root structure. So this is from Lachlan and our research farm up in Armidale. This was some sowing depth work actually done with the University of New England. Grazing canola on the left-hand side. Yes, it does have a taproot, but nowhere near as thick and as long as Pallaton. Comparing to Titan forage rape, our medium type rape on the market still has a relatively strong root system, but Pallaton looks to be the king in that area. So that's where we're getting our increased water use efficiency from. Emma, just want to talk through this slide in a bit more detail on the water use efficiency.
Rightio. So one of the things you'll see in the paddock, so as a farmer or as an agronomist, unless there is a 20% differential in a product's performance, you don't physically see that difference in the field. What we've found with the breeding for Pallaton is it's actually 38% more water use efficient than Goliath. That is one of the giant type rapes that is certainly robust and on the tougher end of the scale in terms of how well it uses moisture. So what you can see in the photo on the right here is actually Pallaton on the far right and a Goliath crop on the left hand side of that, and you can certainly see that the Pallaton isn't stressed, it's green, it's upright, you're not seeing any of that curl and crunch in the leaf. And what this is effectively is how many kilos of dry matter you're going to produce per milliliter of water applied. And this is the one time in farming where the concept of wanting to drive the smart car as opposed to something that is a bit of a gas guzzler is where we're chasing. So massive fit for the Australian market and a really important feature for Pallaton in terms of how far we can push it compared to the Kiwis.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. It definitely goes better in the tougher environments as you head up especially in Victoria and into the northern regions, and well in Western Victoria as well. And I've got a map coming up soon showing how widespread the product is throughout Australia. Now moving on to the fourth important trait, the aphid tolerance. So relative to forage rate, once again, there is a 32% increase in aphid tolerance, and Pallaton also has a higher tolerance to white butterfly and diamondback moth, but it definitely isn't a silver bullet in this area, and you still need to keep an eye on those insect pests. And this is important because the times of the year when forage brassicas are under extreme pressure from either lack of moisture or extreme heat, Pallaton's increased aphid tolerance will allow more dry matter to be grown. So if we look at this photo here, you can see on the left-hand side, this is a demo plot actually from New Zealand, but the Goliath forage rate's been absolutely hammered by aphids, are sucking the life out of the plant, and they'll be getting into the growing point in the crown as well. So once aphids get into the crown, the plant pretty much just stops growth and goes backwards, whereas on the right-hand side, we can see Pallaton clean as a whistle and will continue to grow through those tough times as well. So another pretty important trait. And the last trait, the fifth trait, grazing flexibility. So you can graze Pallaton as early as 56 days after sowing, and comparing that to a forage rate where you have to wait till it reaches maturity. And the 56 days is pretty much just for the Poncho Plus seed treatment. Once you're past that window, you can graze whenever you want. And, when you're grazing a forage rate, the maturity window can change depending on your season, moisture availability, and the recent nitrogen applications. So these can all push the maturity window out. And Titan, for example, is 70 to 90 days, but that doesn't always mean that it's going to mature within that time length. It just does depend on the environmental conditions in that year. So, and if you do graze a forage rate earlier than you're meant to, you can have animal health problems. But for the case of Pallaton, we don't have this problem as it actually doesn't reach maturity because it just continues to grow. As I said before, here's a map of how widespread the growers are throughout Australia. Number one, you can see that the spread of growers throughout Western Australia. Now, it's in some pretty hostile environments over there and almost growing in beach sand. So we do have a couple of case studies, one in particular from that area, and they will be available to you guys to have a look at and look at the economic figures and return on investment from those pretty hard farms over there. Spread right out through New South Wales, and this season we are seeing great growth throughout central New South Wales as well as up into southern Queensland. And you can see the top of Queensland, we've also got a crop right up there in Mackay. The most important growth is always through the temperate regions, and we've got great following through the Western Victoria, South Australia area, as well as Tasmania. Barry, I'd just like to call you in to introduce the Alec Begg case study from South Australia.
Thanks, Isaac. Alec's property is at Reedy Creek, which is about a bit over an hour, probably an hour 20 from Mount Gambier, west from Mount Gambier. Alec saw the Pallaton as a line number a few years back in Ballarat and been pestering me for a period of time. But funny enough, he was quite sceptical when we first started the product around some of the claims that we were giving around production. So after that, well, basically from that point on, it has performed as said. Alec had 23 hectares in. His soil's quite light and sandy. We also planted quite early last year, early September, and got quite a cold spell. It was broken up into 3 areas and sown a week apart with each. But what we found, by the time we were ready to graze the first lot, the rest had pretty much caught up because of the warmth. And we also noticed from the first grazing, the important thing around Pallaton is you've got to know how much feed you physically have there. So definitely do a dry matter cut. Our first dry matter cut was at around about 8%. So we stocked to those levels. But what we probably found after that was that once the plant hardened up and the dry matter increased, we probably didn't have enough stock on. So it went from 8% to 12%, and that's pretty much about nearly a 50% rise in the amount of feed available. And because this product also grows underfoot, capping on top. So we did run into a couple of issues there around grazing, so which we'll talk about a couple of slides down. But as we said, we started grazing in December, and at around those, we ended up probably averaging around about those 87 lambs per hectare, and with a 295 grams per head, the return is exceptional. So Alec actually mentioned to me that pretty much he paid for his cost of his seeds after 3 days grazing. As I said, they put them in between 38 and 40 kilos and took them out at 60. Another thing that Alec also mentioned to me, that the sheep were very clean. He had no issues with dags at all. And the stock would, they didn't walk as much around the paddock. They seemed to not just select the leaf, they actually eat the whole plant. So I think, those live weight gains are actually helped by them just sort of staying in the local area instead of chasing around the whole paddock trying to find what it was. But as you can see there, the gain, we're looking at that $94 and the total return of 6,400. That was prior to cost. But the other thing with this is this stops in May. Now, Alec has basically grazed that through till just recently, where he sadly had to spray it out to put something else in. So that's the return at that point. He moved from when he'd run out of lambs, it moved to having steers, and it's worked well for him there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. That's pretty impressive. That crop got to 12 months old, and I mean, there was probably more like 7 or 8 grazings over that 12-month period. So very impressive, and with multiple stock classes on it as well.
Mm.
All right, moving into the grazing management, as Barry was saying earlier. So on Alec's particular farm, that managed to get away from him at the first grazing, due to him not believing the stocking rates that were needed to be put on there. Is that correct, Barry?
Yeah, pretty much that's it. Again, looking at conventional rates, and as Alec has told me a couple of times since, that it's the growth underfoot that gets you. With a lot of rapes, you'll eat what's there, and then once you take them off, they'll start to grow. You can even see on that first figure there, they've got that new growth coming through. So we ended up with those quite large stalks. So Alec was very, very proactive, and after the stock came out, he come in and topped it back to quite low levels, and within a very short period of time, it's come back to what you see on the right there. Yeah,
exactly. Just a few management tips there. If it does get away and you don't manage to get this correct stocking rate on from the start, and when we're sort of talking an extra 20 or 30% above and beyond the yield that's available there at that point in time, and that's just to take into account the growth underfoot. So getting it back into a vegetative state, you want to drop the growing point as low as you can. As you can see, it grows out from the tallest tip on the plant, and we want that growing point to be as low as possible. So photo on the right hand side just showing the vegetative state it got back to after Alec went and topped it. So we do have a couple of nice diagrams and easier to follow diagrams within our Pallaton Growers booklet, which I'll send to you after this meeting as well. Pallaton is ideally best suited to rotation grazing. Set stocking can work, but utilization is usually lower. Cattle especially should be strip grazed to avoid overfeeding, causing acidosis or nitrate poisoning and brassica bloat. But if you'd like to hear more about grazing management, please get in contact with your local PGG sales agronomist, and they'll point you in the right direction. We do have some great assets within Australia and our New Zealand contacts. Dr. Charlotte Westwood, she is an expert in the Pallaton grazing area, being a veterinarian and nutritionist herself. So I just want to highlight the importance in this diagram here of grazing between 56 days and 70 after sowing. So this is where the optimum quality is. You can see it's roughly around 25 centimeters or just above the gumboot and below the knee. So this is where we'd like people to come in and start grazing, especially with the growth underfoot. By the time you get to 70 days after sowing, the yield can be sort of 2 or 3 tonne more on that particular paddock. And as Barry was saying, get out there and do some dry matter cuts as well. It can change from 8% dry matter to 12% within a couple of weeks. So therefore you've got 30%, 30 or 40% more feed in that paddock than you literally would have a couple of weeks before. So another grazing management, easy to follow diagram. Here's in between 56 days and 70 is the ideal grazing time. As I said, you have more PDL and leaf. Your utilization percentage is higher, your regrowth potential is also high, and your crop feed quality. So this is more where we like the sheep to be grazing as early as possible. If you do have to graze later, growing conditions, or it gets away, and you change your stocking class to a cattle orientated stocking class, your stocking rate has to increase. Your yield's obviously higher, so you've got more stem, and your utilization drops, and so does regrowth potential as well. So to get the most out of the crop and get those sort of 4 to 5 grazings instead of 2 or 3, this is why you need to graze a little bit earlier. And just a quote here from Charlotte Westwood: understocking is unacceptable. So making sure you are setting up good grazing management protocols, making sure you're getting out and weighing your crops, and knowing what your animals are eating and what you're going to offer them as well. So David, do you have anything to add here on the grazing management, what you've seen in the last couple of years?
Yeah, look, I think that is a really important message there from Charlotte, because what we've seen in a lot of areas is we're having to increase our stocking rate by roughly a third. So if we're traditionally stocking it at, say, 45 lambs per hectare, we're having to increase to 60 lambs per hectare, covering off on exactly what Barry was outlining earlier on, the amount of growth still underfoot, actively growing, while the lambs and cattle are on there grazing. So I think a very key comment there from Charlotte: understocking is unacceptable. You're just going to lose a lot of quality, a lot of yield, a lot of benefit from a product like Pallaton if you don't get your stocking rate right. So all of our sales agronomists are there to assist if dry matter tests are needed, feed budgets are needed, stocking rate calculations are needed. So certainly a key there to remember. Yeah,
thanks, David. Some great points there from a man in the field who gets to see the product a lot more than most of us. So we're just almost finished the presentation now, but if you do have any questions, please fire them into the questions and answer section, or use the raise your hand function, and we'll take you off mute towards the end of the presentation. Emma, can you just explain why we recommend sowing 8 kgs a hectare?
Yep, certainly, Isaac. So as you can see from the graph there, the tail end of that number where we look at seeds per hectare, that may look like a huge number and completely unmanageable. However, when you break that down by square metre, what we're looking at with Pallaton is 69 seeds per square metre compared to 71 of your forage rape sown at a fairly standard 4 kilos per hectare. As we said at the start, Pallaton goes through a chromosome doubling process, so it would be the equivalent of a tetraploid ryegrass in the Brassica field. So we'd call it an amphidiploid, which means that the actual seed size is a whisker more than double the size of a standard forage rape. When you take into consideration the increase in the water use efficiency, the effective sowing rate of Pallaton is more like 2.5 kilos of rape compared to 4, which would be a relatively standard rate through the higher rainfall areas.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Just definitely need to clarify that why we recommended the 8 kgs, because it does sound quite high, but it just comes back to the overall seed size from being a tetraploid. So moving through into the basic Brassica management tips. So selecting the right paddock, make sure it's free draining, getting out there and doing soil tests well in advance to rectify any capital phosphate that needs to be applied, or pH levels. Weed control, so in the crop and before the crop, so making sure you're cleaning up any perennial weeds before you go into a brassica, especially and annual weeds as well, so like thistles and any known weeds in those particular paddocks. Seedbed preparation, I've got some photos next on seedbed preparation, making sure you're cultivating or direct drilling in good conditions. Pest control, making sure you're spraying out with glyphosate and an insecticide. It just reduces the risk through establishment, and making sure you're onto it during the crop's growth by putting insecticides on at the correct time for the particular insects that are there. The grazing management, as David was saying before, it's probably one of the most important parts of Pallaton and getting the most out of it. So making sure you're setting up good grazing management protocols and plans, and having plans in place if you do need to bring more animals on, which is usually what happens, and a crop rotation. So don't follow a brassica by a brassica, although Pallaton is slightly better with some soil-borne diseases. We still don't recommend planting 2 brassicas in a row. Paddock preparation, so this is a paddock I visited up in northern Victoria about a month ago. So this farmer, we actually have a proof of concept in there now. He's done a great job of getting his residuals low and cleaning up his weeds before going in, and choosing a nice free draining paddock with high fertility. He cultivated it up to form a firm but fine seedbed, and then went in with his direct drill, but importance of putting fertilizer down the spout as well, and that's why he used the drill. And you can see this crop after 2 weeks, so extremely fast out of the ground, plenty of moisture in the slot. And actually, when I put a soil thermometer into the soil here, and only went sort of one inch down, and they found some pretty hard soil straight away. So this guy done a great job of cultivating and consolidating it back down. Ooh, back one, making sure you're identifying insects on time. So the diamondback moth, a pretty prevalent pest right throughout Australia, and does a lot of damage fast. So if you do have 1 or 2 per plant, get a systemic insecticide into that plant as soon as possible to limit any damage or life cycles with this pest. And yeah, thanks for your attention today, and just carrying on the 5 traits again. So why should I plant Pallaton? Well, it has higher forage yields than a forage rape, has better plant persistence compared to a forage rape, has increased water use efficiency, so that photo of the taproot I was showing you, and the increased aphid tolerance, so allows the plant to grow through some pretty tough times. And then there's the grazing flexibility, so you can graze this plant as early as 56 days after sowing.
Yeah, Isaac, just a few questions that have come up on the Q&A.
Yep.
Effie asks, is Alec the one in the videos on Facebook? And yes, he certainly is. He is our media magnate there. So if you do get a chance, if you haven't viewed the video, go to the PGG Rights and Seeds Australia Facebook page, and you'll be able to see the video. And then Effie also asks, is it okay for me to grow if it's my first time growing brassica? My comment to that would be it may be, but you'd need to look at your current system and requirements. But if anyone does need any more information as to suitability of brassicas and things like that, we do have the Brassica Management Guide available, both in a printed form and electronic version to be able to download. So plenty of additional resources. Dale asks if it can handle any waterlogging and how much. I think with its extensive root system, it can handle waterlogging better than shallow-rooted options like bulb turnips and leafy turnips. I think the main thing to remember is if it's going to be a paddock that will be remaining waterlogged for a long period of time due to lack of drainage or things like that, then obviously the first thing to consider is correcting the drainage. If it's from a flooding event or something like that, as long as the water gets off the paddock fairly quickly and drains through and doesn't have the plant physically under the water for a long period of time, probably 3 to 4, maybe even 5 days, the plant should recover quite adequately. But if it's going into an area that you know is going to be waterlogged, then maybe there are better options out there for that situation.
Yeah, definitely. Some good points there on the waterlogging. I have seen it myself in some pretty wet environments, but I would say it is more tolerant, as you said, but in the end, it will, if it is waterlogged for long periods of time, it will end up dying.
Yep. The other question also, or three questions now, they're starting to come in. Jamie asks, are there many options for weed control? There are some options there, Jamie. I think the best way to get around that one is just to consult your local agronomist with regard to some options there around registered usage and things like that. John asked which furred at planting and after grazing. I think, again, it comes down to whether you're looking for really driving your dry matter production or not. I think one of the key things is that we're treating this as a forage brassica. If you're in an area where you might have other crops like canola, this is a true forage. We're not looking for oilseed production, so make sure you keep your sulphur inputs low to avoid any animal health issues. Build up of sulphur in long maturing forage brassicas for grazing can lead to a build up of a compound sulphur methyl cystide something or other, SMCO, which can lead to potential red water and anemia in particularly cattle. So try and stay away from sulphur containing fertilisers. Driving production after grazing and things like that, certainly responds very well to nitrogen applications. Certainly a good dose of phosphorus at planting will aid root development and early vigour. And also, do you need additional fibre when feeding lambs? Yes, you do. Lambs and cattle and animals know when they have a requirement for additional fibre and things like that. So if you put some ad lib fibre, some hay or straw or something like that out there in the paddock, if they need it, they'll go and actively look for it. But you do often get a better response and better live weight conversion when you do add a fibre source in there. So certainly add fibre, also making sure that you do have a very good access to a water source as well. So there's some of the key criteria there. So some really good questions there, guys. Effie's come out with, how can I find out what retailers stock this? She lives in Lang Lang. Yes, we do have accredited resellers. I think the easiest thing would be, again, to contact your local PGG Rights and Seeds agronomist, have a talk to them, and we can put you in touch with your nearest accredited reseller.
One more question there for you, David. I think you answered it in the chat function as well.
Yep. What other pasture species can be in a mix? I think the key to this is with the value of the seed for Pallaton. I think you're wanting to treat that as the primary feed source. If you're wanting to put another option in there, possibly millet would, a small amount of millet would give you a little bit of extra fibre in there. Pallaton, like a lot of brassicas, generally are fairly high in protein, so adding other legume sources may not necessarily give any additional benefit. They may actually cause an excess of protein build-up, and you'll lose more energy by trying to convert or disuse that bypass protein. So you can put an Italian ryegrass in the base of the sward, but again, you're not wanting to outcompete the Pallaton itself. So keep any other additional inputs at a fairly low level, but there are certainly some other options. Maybe even some chicory undersown probably wouldn't be a bad option either.
Another question coming from Jamie Davies about frost tolerance. So
frost tolerance at establishment, I'm assuming, Jamie. Like most, some plants can be somewhat susceptible at sowing. I think there, as long as we're able to get the plant up and out of the ground and starting to set its root system fairly quickly, it will actually tolerate some of the frosting and the lifting of the soil with frosting events. Being a tetraploid large seed, as Emma alluded to, the vigour of the germination is very high, so it will get out of the ground very quickly. later on, once it is established and you're looking to graze, frost tolerance, it certainly tolerates the frost very well. The only thing to remember there is your general Brassica grazing management in regard to grazing frosted crops and not allowing stock to be on there too early in the day.
Just a little bit of an update on the frosts. At Beggs's, Alec Beggs's, they had 4 frosts very early. It didn't seem to affect the plant, but I think it, as I said, it probably definitely slowed its growth down in those early stages. But didn't kill any plants, probably just slowed it.
Yep, I'd certainly add to that. There are a couple of crops in and around Ballarat which did receive snow last week, and they are still looking pretty handy at the start of this week.
It's a pretty good frost.
Yeah, I think they'll just relate back to soil temperature at the time as well and how fast it can grow out of it. So, yeah, John, back on your question on the fertility and you know what fert should I be putting on at planting. It all depends on what your soil fertility levels are to start with as well. So go and get a soil test. It's no different to any Brassica during establishment. So DAP and MAP down the spout is super important. And then nitrogen after that to feed you're pretty much just feeding yield from there on. So
just with that nitrogen, make sure that either pretty much as soon as you get the stock off, you need to get it on because it comes back so quickly. You just got to make sure that you're not running into nitrate problems. You probably need that 18 to 20 days in between. Yeah, and it's actually really hard to get nitrogen on before the first grazing with this crop because you are grazing it so fast. So yeah, good point there, Barry. You do need to be careful of. You do need to get it on as soon as possible after that first grazing. All right, I think we've almost covered every question there, and we've gone a little bit over time, but. Thank you very much for your input and engagement today, and thanks for jumping on in your lunch break. And if you do have any more questions, please feel free to get in contact with our local team of sales agronomists, and I'm sure they'll be happy to help you. So once again, thanks for your time today.